Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Professor Mary Crossan with us today. Dr. Mary Crossan is a distinguished university professor of strategic leadership at the Ivey Business School at Western, recognized for her excellence in teaching, research, and service. In 2021, she was named among the top 2% of the most cited scientists in her field, with expertise in organizational learning, strategy, leadership character, and improvisation. Her research has been widely published in top journals like the Strategic Management Journal and Academy of Management Review. She has co-authored several textbooks and developed management tools, including the Improvise to Innovate video with Second City Improvisation Company. Her recent focus is on developing leader character with ongoing work in education and consultancy worldwide. Dr. Crossan also co-hosts the Question of Character podcast. In this episode, Professor Mary Crossan shares profound insights from her research-focused book, The Character Compass: Transforming Leadership for the 21st Century. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Mary Crossan as she joins our podcast. It is an honor to have you with us today, Professor Mary Crossan.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Professor Mary Crossan, your book emphasizes the importance of leadership character as a foundation for organizational success. Can you explain what leader character is and why it is so crucial in today's leadership landscape?
For sure. So when we talk about leadership, we're talking about the disposition to lead, not just the position of leadership. And I think that's pretty interesting to start with the word leader and say, we all need the disposition to lead in this world that has become increasingly more challenging, to bring the best of ourselves to whatever it is that we do. The character piece is the facet then of that disposition to lead that we can rely on. And the actual definition of character is, and I'm going to unpack it for you, an interconnected suite of embodied and virtuous habits. So there, we're going to start with it's interconnected. We're going to pick up that it's virtuous and it's a set of habits. And then it is these virtuous habits that influence judgment and human flourishing. Another facet is that it can be observed, assessed, and developed, because a lot of people have misconceptions about it. They think it's, just something that's incredibly subjective, but there's a science behind character. Another interesting facet of character is that it's universal but reflexive to context. So the prior research about character, goes back to Confucius, Aristotle, Plato, but modern day psychologists Martin Seligman and Christopher Peterson wrote Character, Strengths, and Virtues, identifying a set of virtues that were universal across time, context, and even religion. But here is also the final piece that usually trips people up about character. It can operate in a deficient or excess vice state. So even something like integrity, which is a virtue, can operate in an excess vice state. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. Now, you asked, why is it important? Also, well, look, it is a blind spot for us. It wasn't until 2008 when we were putting leadership on trial, looking at the global economic crisis and thinking as a business school, what were the failures of leadership? And we realized at that time, when we did focus groups around the world, that it wasn't failures of competencies for the most part, it was failures of character. But people didn't know what character was. They didn't know if you could develop it. There were different views about what it was. So what we tried to do at that time then, since 2008, is bring a robust science to understanding character. And of course, the metrics that show the performance improvements are quite significant. Fred Keel had done some really good work that looked at return on assets, for example, with respect to character. And ourselves, the research that we've been looking at are, all of the things that affect financial metrics, like 18% improvement in employee voice between weak and strong character, a 16% improvement in things like psychological safety, which we know to be absolutely central to great decision-making in organizations. So there's a lot of metrics that get moved with the development of character. And then those effects then influence things like financial performance.
Professor, you have developed a practical framework for implementing leader character. Could you share some key elements of this framework and how it can be applied across different sectors like public, private, and not-for-profit?
Yeah. So for those that are just listening, picture that there's a wheel, and in the middle of the wheel is the word judgment. And Aristotle would have called that practical wisdom. Every dimension of character, including judgment, has a set of observable behaviors associated with it. Now, there's a constellation of 10 dimensions that go around judgment. So it's not just having good judgments because you're insightful, intuitive, analytical, cognitively complex, but what are these other muscles? We often think about them as muscles that you have to rely on. So the other 10 are transcendence, drive, collaboration, humanity, humility, integrity, temperance, justice, accountability, and courage. And again, recall that each of those dimensions of character has a set of observable behaviors that we can actually look at so that we can observe them and develop them. And then let's remind ourselves, given the definition, that any one of these virtuous behaviors can operate in a vice state, either deficient because they're underdeveloped, or in the excess vice state. And this is the piece that usually has tripped us up. A person can have a lot of drive, and you want the most amount of drive that you can get. It's like the engine of a race car. You really want that, strength and drive. But like the race car, if you're going to have a great engine, you need the best braking system in the world. And that'd be like the temperance, the patient, calm self-control that allows you to be able to handle the power of the drive that you've got. Because without that, we end up finding that the behaviors that we thought were going to be virtuous are actually operating in a vice state. So let me just give you some examples from drive. So if you look at the behaviors of drive, demonstrates initiative. Well, if it's operating in the excess state because you don't have support from humanity or humility, you just become dictatorial about what it is that you're doing. Your passion, being a passionate person becomes being fanatical. Your results orientation becomes having tunnel vision. Striving for perfection or striving for excellence becomes striving for perfection, for example. And, being a vigorous person then becomes this kind of forceful entity that actually alienates people in the organization. So that's the basic architecture of the framework.
In your research, you have worked with numerous organizations around the world. What are some common challenges leaders face when trying to cultivate and embody strong leader character?
The first thing is our misconceptions about character. So getting the science of what character is can help course correct around those things. So I don't know that many people have thought, for example, that you could overweight on integrity. People just assume that, first of all, we say we value integrity, not recognizing that you actually have to develop it. How do you become somebody who's candid, transparent, authentic, consistent, and principled, for example? So we often say it's, valuing integrity is like telling somebody to run a marathon and not train for it. So our misconceptions, we don't understand what it is. We don't understand that integrity could operate in a vice state. So we just our principles just become, dogmatic, if we don't have the humility and humanity, for example, or justice, for example, to support it. Even when we do, people get pretty quickly what the architecture of character is. Like, I think the light bulb goes on. And an interesting thing is we judge ourselves on our intention and others on their behavior. So none of us intend to have our behaviors operate in this vice state. And yet when we begin to think about it, we go, okay, I get it. I get why somebody sees me operating in that particular way. So then the next part of the challenge becomes, so what am I going to do about it? And the development of character, even though we have a massive amount of tools on how to assess character, like the leader character insight assessment in both self and 360, development materials like the Virtuosity mobile development app that puts the learning and development for character in your pocket. We've got all of these kinds of things. Getting people to go to what we call the character gym, realizing just like your exercise, what are you going to do on a daily basis to actually commit to the character development? So I'd say that was the second piece, right? Getting people to get that paradigm of the character gym in their mind. The third is, even when we get to those pieces, and they're pretty fundamental, that goes a long way, we need to also rewire our organizations. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, I know, where we want to elevate character alongside competence in all of the practices of the organization. So you don't want those practices being like a headwind operating against the exercise of character in the organization. So for example, if you're not hiring people with strength of character or promoting them in the organization, and in fact, you're actually promoting people with imbalances of character, we're going to create headwinds in the organization that make it really difficult to operate.
You discuss the role of leader character in areas like leadership development, culture building, and HR practices. Could you dive deeper into how leader character influences corporate strategy and decision making?
Yeah, so let's start with strategy and then drop down to decision making more generally. So, my field of expertise over 40 years has been in strategy, and I only wish I had seen character earlier in my career. I spent a lot of time understanding things like strategic renewal from the perspective of organizational learning and agility and improvisation. And what I didn't understand is the capacity for strategic agility resides in our capacity for organization agility. And fundamentally, that comes from our individual agility. And character itself is a mechanism and a way to actually understand that kind of agility. If we look at things like collaboration as an example, and the behaviors associated with it of being flexible, interconnected, open-minded, you begin to get a sense that if you're limited in those areas, it will fundamentally cascade through to the rest of the organization and hamper strategic agility. So the basic insight to get out of this is that most failures of strategy are not failures of competence, that when we actually examine them, they're failures of character. And they could be emanating from lack of courage. Think about things like a lack of accountability when we're privileging our own self-interest as opposed to the long-term success of the organization, where we lack, the transcendence to see the possibility for how do you get both short-term and long-term performance at the same time. Maybe we lack the temperance or the patience or calm to navigate really stormy waters and we panic, around how we operate. We may lack humanity, humility, collaboration to navigate through a new way or a new approach for where that organization can go. And I'd like to make a connection in between strategy and the culture that has to support that. So the quote seems to go and be applied to Drucker, although there is some contention as to who actually said it. But the notion that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we've got an article that's coming out that is character eats culture for breakfast. And that the culture of an organization will be a reflection of the character of the individuals within it, for better and for worse. So if we think of an inside-out approach, we can then begin to understand that the strength of character of the individuals, particularly the senior leadership of the organization that cascades quite a bit down, will manifest in the practices of the organization, its culture. And that will produce strategy that is either strong or weak in the strategy. But I also want to pick up on your idea about decision-making, because what I love about the work around character, it's in the micro moments of everyday decision-making. And we often talk about the place between stimulus and response. Like, what stimulus are we paying attention to? How are we operating in that space between stimulus and response as individuals to actually elevate our judgment and decision making, and while at the same time doing that with a great strength of well-being. So at the end of the day, we're not just so crippled by the heavy lifting we've been doing in organizations, but to actually feel that we get the renewable energy that comes from exercising character alongside competence.
Professor, one of the key topics in your book is manifesting purpose. How does leader character help leaders clarify and communicate their organization's purpose, and why is that so important?
Well, as you know, purpose is a pretty hot topic in organizations today. And it is important, but what we want to try to pick up from the lens of character is purpose itself will only be as strong as the character of the individuals in it. You can manufacture a purpose. You can picture, if you've got weaknesses of character, you're lacking courage or transcendence or accountability, nice purpose statement on the wall, but what's going to happen with it? A great statement of purpose actually arises from the strength of character that produces it. And we often use workshops that activate first on things like transcendence, being purposive, like how do I actually become somebody who's purposive so that I can produce a purpose statement in the organization that's meaningful and that we actually live every single day. So for me, it is the production of anything around purpose is going to be dependent upon our capacity to live purpose, and therefore having it, come to life off the wall into the work we do every day really requires a lot of character to support it.
In the book, you explore the link between leader character and executive recruitment. How can organizations assess and prioritize leader character in the hiring process?
Such a great question. One that we get quite a bit because people get pretty excited about this. I just wrote an article in MIT Sloan talking about this particular issue, and it's the fact that we end up hiring for competence and firing for character. And it's this kind of notion of people get that it's important, but they just, because they lack the science of what it is or how to do it, they've been a little bit distant from it, or in some ways they believe that they're doing it. They go, we already look for these things. But what we've often done is overweight on some dimensions and underweight others. And we've been fooled, if you want to call it, by what a character actually is. So a key insight that we pick up about, if you want to hire for character as well as competence, you actually have to know what it is. And to know what it is, it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's working on the development of character. It is going to the character gym. And I can assure you that if you're doing that day in and day out, your capacity to observe character in yourself and others is strengthened. So I'm going to give you 5 stages of development just to make the point around why this would be so important in selection. So if we start with the first is this understanding, observe and identify character. That becomes even important in ourselves. There might have been a time we were more courageous, and now we can go, what happened to us? All right, let's see if we can, get that piece back of ourselves. When we can observe and identify it in ourselves and others, we're able to then go to the second stage, which is how do we activate on character, reminding, priming, and reinforcing it. So, for example, we use things like music to activate character. So we've got a study that we've published, which talks about the science of music, how it unpacks or it activates on the underpinnings of character development, our physiology, our affect, that's feeling, emotion, and mood, behavior, and cognition. And those systems then underpin things like the development of temperance, being patient or calm, or things like humanity, being empathy and compassionate. So we can activate on our character. We can go to the character gym, learn about how to activate it. Stage 3, this is the part, the pioneering effort that we're trying to get to, So what am I actually going to do to become a person who's more calm? Not just to activate on it when I need it in the moment, but actually exercise those muscles day in and day out to become that person. And then once we look at, there are actually 62 behaviors in that character wheel. So look at, this is a lifetime journey and a great opportunity for development. So then we want to be thinking about in stage 4, how does the development of a particular area of character dimension like temperance depend on other areas like your humanity or humility? So many people find their temperance takes a big hit because they become impatient with other people. They lack humanity, in understanding others and having empathy. And then we want to go from that connecting stage of stage 4 into stage 5, which is understanding how our character holds up under stress or under various conditions that actually undermine our character. So I go back to selection. You can begin to understand that the journey of development and going through those stages makes you, if you want to call it, a student of character. You understand what it is. You understand how to develop it. You can observe it in others. And therefore, when it comes to selection, it becomes something that becomes much more easy to identify in another.
Your book also addresses diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. How does leader character contribute to fostering a more inclusive and equitable organizational culture?
Well, I think this is just a wonderful place where we can, if I want to call it, supercharge efforts in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right now, I think we're struggling in many of them. We've got the intention, again, positive intention, and yet study after study really is revealing that the atomic particles of why we struggle with this are actually around character issues, where, we look at things like humanity and beginning to have that kind of level of empathy and compassion, and not just in a tick the box kind of notion of gender, race, or sexual orientation, but actually down to the individuality of the human being. And then what we do find with character development, I mentioned these PABC underpinnings: physiology, affect, behavior, cognition. The cognitive part of it is our core beliefs. And those core beliefs can manifest a lot of bias that is really quite dysfunctional when it comes to an understanding of the inequities that exist in systems, that people often don't even see them because their biases prevent them from seeing it. So we find that the development of character really enables the DEI initiatives, and yet the DEI initiatives are also great places to challenge character development. So I love the twinning of the two together.
Leader character is said to help steer organizations through positive and lasting change. Can you share an example of an organization that successfully implemented leader character and achieved sustained excellence as a result?
Yeah, I think, I like to go to ones that are also revealed in some publicly available data. So we wrote an article on Canada Revenue Agency, which may seem to be an unlikely place to be thinking about it, but it's a 50,000 person public sector organization that you can imagine would be pretty, mechanized around how they operate in what they do. And we wrote an article in Organizational Dynamics for people who are interested in selection. They actually began to look at character leadership in the selection of executives in the organization. And that journey now, I think they began around 2018. They continue to be one of the top employers in the country. And their metrics about how all sorts of key performance indicators have changed are very much influenced by the development of character that has to actually underpin selection. So let's just go back to the prior topic of conversation. You can't select on character if you're not developing character. So I think the key facet of the success that they've enjoyed is the emphasis that they put on character development think about that. We think about it like the roots of a tree system and impacting everything you do: strategy, culture, EDI, risk management. And so these investments in character development have really important impacts for the organization. So for listeners, that would be a good article to take a look at, organizational dynamics and character, a case study of character at Canada Revenue Agency.
Professor, my last question. For listeners interested in developing their own leadership character, what are some first steps they can take to begin strengthening this vital trait?
Yeah. Well, this podcast is a good start, because just developing awareness about what character is, that's step one of that development ladder that I talked about, being able to observe and identify. There's a lot of tools around this, like as I mentioned, the leader character, self, and 360 assessment around it. And yet somebody could even just look at the wheel itself and begin to self-identify around where their strengths and weaknesses might be. We have written extensively all sorts of things beyond the Character Compass book, which give lots of resources and insights. So I'd say to the listener, start there. The second piece is getting to the development of character. So things like the Virtuosity Character app are a really good place that you can start to think about, how am I going to go to the character gym? And again, we've written a lot about character development, so hopefully it sparks people's attention and interest in how they can develop character. And finally, then, I think when you're starting to move through those stages, you begin to understand in an organization where there are those headwinds against character. How can you elevate character alongside competence? Are you ready to incorporate character into things like selection, reward, performance management, and promotion? Those are the kinds of things that I would then get people to think about.
In this episode, Professor Mary Crossan has shared profound insights from her research-focused book, The Character Compass, Transforming Leadership for the 21st Century. Her expertise in leadership character and its practical applications has provided us with valuable perspectives on how to navigate complexity of modern leadership. Professor Mary Crossan, thank you for joining us today and for offering such impactful insights. We are grateful for your time and the wisdom you have shared.
Thank you, Deepak. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Professor.